Since this is probably our last video for 2024 on the channel, I thought it was time to do my usual once per year only distro tier list. Things have moved a little bit. I have tried a few new distros, even though I didn't necessarily make videos about them. So it's gonna be an interesting look at how things stand at the end of 2024. And also an interesting look at our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Kasm Workspaces. It's a project for running Linux desktops, Windows, or various apps from your web browser. You can create multiple workspaces and you can run them on your own hardware, or you can use Kasm's software as a service offering. The Kasm project has now also integrated Sysbox. It's an open source container runtime that allows users to run system software within rootless containers by providing enhanced container isolation. Kasm and Sysbox together bring the best of both worlds. You have the portability of containers and the functionality of virtual machines, but it's all accessible from your web browser on any device. You can run the Kasm open source images directly, or you have Kasm Workspaces Community Edition, which provides an orchestration engine for self-hosting. To learn more about Kasm Workspaces, click the link in the description below. Okay, so we'll start with what is probably the biggest Linux distro out there, and it's still probably Ubuntu. So last year Ubuntu was put into the average category, and this year I think I will move it up a tier to good. I don't like the direction that Ubuntu is taking, with snaps everywhere, with rebuilding all the tooling for snaps and permissions, even though this already exists for other formats. I think it's duplicated work. I think snaps are inherently inferior in a lot of ways to Flatpaks. The rest of the Linux world has adopted Flatpaks and not snaps. But snaps are now way faster than they once were. They have fewer issues than before. They have a permission system, even though it's experimental. And the distro itself, Ubuntu, is now up to date on the GNOME version it uses. It even tries to improve it a little bit with extensions that change things, like better tiling. So I will place this distro in good. It is definitely not for Linux purists who traditionally don't really enjoy snap packages, but it's now back to a point where I could recommend it to most people and not feel guilty or ashamed of that recommendation. Now on to Fedora. Last year it was top tier, and this year it still is top tier. They added FlatHub by default, which fixed one issue Fedora had. They have a modern stack for Wayland, Flatpaks, Pipewire, recent drivers, and still pretty damn good repos that are well stocked. They also are now on DNF4, which is a much better, much faster package manager, way better than the previous iteration of it, which fixes issues that I had with RPM, at least on Fedora. They also have plenty of spins of the distro that are already there or that are coming, like for example, one with Cosmic, but they also have one with Budgie. I really like Fedora as a distro. It's the engine for Linux's future. Even though some people have to be dragged screaming into that future, it is happening. And basically, if you look at Fedora, you look at what distributions will all be in the next 2-3 years, which I think is really cool. It's still a top tier distro and it works for even more people now. Now KDE Neon is next. It was in average last year and I'm bumping it down a notch this year. The reason is there's just not enough testing on this distro and not enough people working on it to really be a stable and reliable solution. Cracks were starting to appear last year, but this year they flat out broke some upgrades and some systems by moving to a new LTS base, and before that they had big issues with the move to Plasma 6. It's just not a reliable system in a lot of cases, and while I really like the idea of Neon, I think the new KDE OS that is going to be immutable, it's gonna be a more solid base to showcase KDE technologies than using an LTS Ubuntu base and trying to push major KDE updates to that as fast as they could. Neon is just not a good enough system to use in day-to-day life, and so it's gonna have to be in no thanks. Now, I never made a video about it, but I did play around with MX Linux this year, and I will put it in average. It uses a Debian stable base, which would automatically make it unsuitable in my eyes, but they do have updated packages in their repos to move beyond what Debian stable offers, fortunately. Now, MX Linux just doesn't give me anything that I really want here. It's not necessarily a faster distro, it's not necessarily more lightweight, apart from maybe disk space usage, which I really don't care about, because I never even use 1 terabyte on my hard drive. I have external drives for everything that doesn't belong on my computer, so disk usage is just not a factor in my opinion. MX Linux is not a bad system. It works, it's stable, it's well tested, and they have their own MX tools to handle admin tasks graphically. But it just doesn't offer me anything I really care about. Now, the Fluxbox version would be really interesting though, because that's something I've never really tried all that much. Do tell me if you want a dedicated video on MX Linux. I understand why some people love it, it just doesn't offer me specifically anything I want, so it's going in average. Now, Deepin was in hell no last year, the bottom tier, and it's still in hell no for me this year. As a distro, it is just completely outdated with very old package versions that they don't update often enough. And they're missing plenty of things in these repos. They tried to fix that with their own packaging format called Linglong, but it doesn't do anything useful or new. It just seems to be a flatpak fork if you look at the directory structure. Now, Deepin looks nice if your needs are very simple, and they have default apps that look cool, but it's just completely underpowered all around compared to GNOME, KDE, XFCE, Budgie, maybe even the first alphas of Cosmic. You quickly run into the limits of everything here, and when you start installing stuff that is not specifically designed for Deepin, you quickly realize that this carefully curated and well-designed look completely falls apart once you go out of Deepin's applications. Now, Deepin as a distro, I just don't understand who would use it. If you really like the Deepin desktop, unlike me, then you can use Ubuntu Deepin or any other distro that has access to the Deepin desktop. But Deepin as a distro? No. Now, elementaryOS was in no thanks last year because it just had too many small problems and it was just too outdated. It's moving back up to average this year. That's because they fixed their biggest issue, which is no FlatHub by default. elementaryOS enforced Flatpak. You could not install anything graphically apart from Flatpak apps. The problem is they only added their own remote, which was completely understocked. You had no useful apps out of the box, and that meant a convoluted and frankly bad experience for newcomers. Now, this is solved in elementaryOS 8. They also now have a Wayland section, meaning they are now sort of starting to be future-proof. They ported their tools to GTK 4, which is also future-proofing the entire desktop. They're ready to move into the future. It is no longer a bad proposition. It's now a solid one. If you like their desktop, you like their apps, you want to have a stable base, but you want to have rolling updates to the applications and the desktop, elementaryOS is good now. Or at least it's on par with the baseline of what I would expect for a desktop distro. So it's average. Now, last year, Linux Mint was in the top tier, and it's going to stay there this year as well. It's not an impressive distro in any way. It doesn't look super snazzy, it doesn't run super fast, but it is very stable. It has graphical tools for virtually everything, and these are pre-installed. Cinnamon is a very good, very dependable desktop. It will onboard any newcomer properly or any old hand without any issues. They even have updated kernels by default now, instead of leaving you on older versions, so Mint is actually installable on newer computers as time moves on, which is good. In my opinion, Mint is the recommendation for anyone who wants to try out Linux. It will not woo any of your friends with snazzy graphics and a super modern look. It looks like an old Windows system, but it really works, it is customizable, it is fine, and it's probably the most dependable and stable distro out there. So, top tier. Now, last year, Arch Linux was put in average because, well, it is a hard one to rate. For a newcomer, It's one thing that I would never recommend because it just does not paint a good picture of how simple and easy Linux can be. Unless that newcomer wants to learn by reading a wiki and they want to start by being confronted with a terminal-based installer script to learn each part of the system right off the bat, then it is a bad pick for a newcomer. But also, as a distro itself, for more experienced people, it is fantastic. It is super customizable, it is an excellent base for any other distro to use, it is fast, it is up to date, and while the AUR is, in my opinion, not a very dependable system, because third-party packages made by people you don't know is never a good option on any system, this thing is still well stocked and well reviewed. I would say reviewed enough that I wouldn't really worry that it's not software straight from the developers. And with the recent cash infusion from Valve and the Sovereign Tech Fund, they will even have a more reliable packaging system. So I guess this year I'm putting Arch in good. Just stop recommending Arch for everyone that is straight out of macOS or Windows and just wants to try out Linux. Arch is not the right distro to recommend to anyone starting out, unless that person really is well versed in how computers work and they want to learn by doing, by reading. Do not recommend Arch to newcomers, please. Now on to the distro I use on both my computers, which is Tuxedo OS. It is basically Ubuntu LTS plus some Neon packages once they are stable enough for the KDE desktop. They also add Tuxedo tools that are really meant for running this distro on Tuxedo computers. It is a niche distro for Tuxedo consumers, and I am one of those, so I use it. I will put it in good like last year because it's really solid. The upgrade to Tuxedo OS 4, moving to a new LTS base and to a new Plasma desktop, worked really well once they polished it. Although it seems like there were a few issues in the first deployment of it, they quickly course corrected, and the only thing that stopped working for me was Resolve, and that's just because it's a very stupidly packaged application by the developer of Resolve instead of being done with a multi-distro compatible format like a Flatpak, so it's not on Tuxedo OS. Basically, it's just a very, very good distro for KDE. It's really more meant to be run on Tuxedo hardware because it comes with specific drivers for that and with a Tuxedo control center that might not work properly on other devices, but you can still run it on any computer and it's probably one of the best Ubuntu plus KDE distros. Now Debian I placed in average last year and I will move it up to good this year. I'm talking about Debian stable here, that's the only version I tried. Why would I put it in good? Because the fact that it's woefully outdated in its repos and in hardware support doesn't matter as much nowadays thanks to Flatpak. If the hardware you have works well on Debian stable, you can now just use that system properly. You can get the latest versions of apps without any issues, because now you have a recent version of Flatpak in Debian 12, and that just wasn't the case in Debian 11. Now they also have proprietary firmware easily available and installable if you want it, meaning it's much better suited to a desktop use. So Debian stable, at least for the use case of a desktop PC, it's now really good, no longer just average. It offers a very rock-solid experience, plus the ability to get any app you want. PopOS placed in no thanks last year because it just did not receive any updates to its desktop. They did update the base of the distro, some drivers and the kernel, but as of now, it's still based on 22.04, which is unacceptable for a Linux desktop going in 2025. The other issue is that the desktop environment it ships is a very old GNOME version without any of the recent patches of the past 5 versions, which really improved how GNOME works, especially with Wayland. It is just a crime to stick your users onto that old version of GNOME. But also, PopOS has their new alpha right now with Cosmic, and Cosmic is pretty nice. The problem is, it's in alpha, that's not a good base to judge a distro on. So for now, it is still in no thanks. But chances are it will be in either average or good once a version of PopOS with Cosmic comes out in stable. depending on what's missing from the experience and how stable the distro ends up being. Right now though, the available versions of PopOS that you can download and install, they're just a bad choice. Objectively, they're not good. Just pick any GNOME-focused version and add a few extensions. You can replicate that PopOS experience almost to a T without having to use a very old distro and an old version of GNOME. Don't use PopOS 22.04. It might be a lot better when they release the one with Cosmic, but right now I just cannot recommend it. Now let's talk OpenSUSE. OpenSUSE Tumbleweed was in good last year, and that's where it stays. It's still a solid rolling release with the solid OpenSUSE config tools and system admin stuff. These tools look really ugly and they are clearly from an age past, but they work and they're solid. Tumbleweed is also very stable for a rolling release, likely the most stable one I've ever used, so it's still very good. As per Leap, it was in average, and this year I will just drop it down to no thanks. For me, it doesn't offer anything interesting. It still uses KDE 5.27, which is unacceptable after a full year of Plasma 6 being out, and it being the least buggy KDE version in a long while. It's also stuck on GNOME 45 when 47 is out. The kernel is 6.4, it defaults to X11. It's just an old base with old software, and that's not what I want or what I expect from a desktop. Anyway, it's just a no thanks for me personally. It doesn't do anything I need, and there are better options for what it does, so I'm not using Leap. Gentoo is next, and for me it will stay in no thanks because I just don't care about what it offers. I understand why it exists, and I understand why some people like it, but to me, the potential performance gain of compiling things from a hardware specifically is just not worth the wait time or the learning curve. I really like tinkering, but this is way too much for me, and honestly, judging from benchmarks, you will gain like 2% performance after wasting hours. The use flags are a cool thing. You can build versions of the software that only come with the features that you want. But I don't care about that. The standard basic versions of packages work, and they install fast on other distros, so yeah. Even Gentoo seems to realize that, as they are expanding their selection of pre-compiled packages for people who don't want to wait too long. So Gentoo is in no thanks for me. It doesn't mean that it's a bad distro, it just means that I don't want to use it because what it's good at matters not at all to my use case. Manjaro was in no thanks last year, and it will stay there this year as well. I just do not like this thing. It is less stable than many other rolling releases. It is not that well tested in my experience. I hear people telling me it's solid and works for them, but I just do not see the value of using this thing. If you use the AUR a lot mixed with Manjaro packages, your system tends to become unstable because the AUR is not meant to be used without the latest versions of packages from Arch, and Manjaro doesn't have those latest versions. And if you don't use the AUR, then what is the point of an Arch-based distro? So yeah, no thanks for me. Manjaro didn't evolve in any way that would change my mind. I just don't think it's a good choice. NixOS was in good last year, and I'm bumping it down to average for this year. That's mostly because things have stalled for a while as the community reorganized itself after some drama I won't go into because I'm sure someone will think this is political or whatever. And it's the end of the year. I just don't want to deal with the stay in your lane people and their ill-informed comments that always pop up around these kinds of discussions. Now, a month ago, they released a new update, which seems very solid in terms of new packages and updates to the base system. And I still really like the concept of NixOS with its declarative configuration that fits into one single file if you want it. You can perfectly replicate that. It's really solid. But also, documentation is really bad. It's also completely dependent on third-party packages made by third-party individuals, so same issue here as the AUR, but very likely less well tested and reviewed. I prefer stuff made directly by the developers. I trust them more than any third party trying to package their stuff on top of what they already tried to do. NixOS is probably never going to have official developer-built Nix packages, or at least not that many. I like Nix, it just doesn't work for me. It's good, it's gonna stay in average, and hopefully the distro can rebuild itself. The community seems to have reorganized, so hopefully it's gonna climb back up again. Now, I'm just gonna group gaming distros. The one I tested includes SteamOS, Holo ISO, and Nobara. SteamOS will stay in top tier, not as a desktop distro because it sucks in desktop mode, it's old, outdated and limited, but as a gaming OS, it is fantastic. On a PC or on a handheld, it's just the best gaming operating system out of all consoles and all PCs. Holo ISO will go in hell no, because it's just broken AF and it will refuse to install on most hardware I tested it on. As per Nobara, I placed it in good last year, and it's still in good this year. They even made it better with a much nicer graphical updating tool. It just works well for gaming, and it provides a really good desktop experience too. On immutable distros, Vanilla OS was in no thanks last year, and I will keep it there still. It received a solid update this year with better graphical tools, completely revamped command line utilities, but the base concept just doesn't really work for me. I understand why it exists, what it offers, and why it's good for some people. I think it's cool, but I just don't need containerized distros to run programs from other distros and to test things. I just need to be able to install programs on a relatively stable system, and basically that need is completely fulfilled with Flatpak and some basic distro packages. I don't need to jump through a lot of hoops to accomplish that using Vanilla OS. I think some people do need that kind of specific thing. I really do not. It's not a bad distro, but for me personally, it's no thanks because I don't need it. Now, I'll finish on a few others. Zorin OS will stay in no thanks. It offers some nice ease of use tools based on top of GNOME, but it's still a bit out of date, even though Flatpaks made that older base a bit less problematic. It's still a very slowly updated desktop. It's still on GNOME 45 as far as I remember. It just doesn't do it for me. As per Solus, it moves to no thanks. The team has managed to right the ship and actually update the distro after it was stuck in limbo for a while, but the main draw of Solus is Budgie, and I don't care about Budgie as a desktop right now. I want to see what they're gonna do next with a complete rewrite using non-GTK libraries, but this really doesn't seem to be moving or happening at all, so for me, Solus just doesn't do anything interesting. It just hasn't regained a reliable enough image that I would use it. Finally, Asahi Linux stays in average. It really should be in no thanks because I don't own a Mac anymore, and that's the only reason to ever use Asahi. But also, I like what these developers are doing, and if you do own an Apple Silicon Mac, Asahi and I guess Fedora Asahi are the only things that you can run, and this distro is getting better fast. Not all the hardware is supported though on any of these M1, M2, M3 Macs, so I can't really recommend it yet fully. So I'm putting it at average for the effort they're putting into it, but realistically, it should be no thanks. Now, I know I'm missing a lot of distros that you use or you might have used, and this year hasn't been really all that rich in me discovering or testing out new distributions because I was mostly focused on rebuilding my digital ecosystem, launching the podcast, and launching the daily Linux news show for Patreons and members. I started teaching, I started another YouTube channel at the end of this year on Warhammer 40k. It's in French, so it probably doesn't interest any of you guys. But yeah, this year was jam-packed and I just did not have much time to try new distros. But do leave me the distros you would want me to test in the comments. If it's just Ubuntu with a theme, I don't care, I don't want to test it. If it's just an Arch-based distro with a different theme, I also don't care. But if it's something that does something really different or that is built in a very different way, then sure, I should take a look at it next year. Anyway, this is all very subjective, this is all my personal ranking and tier list. Your opinions might be entirely different because your use case might be entirely different. So don't be too harsh in the comments, be polite, be civil, everyone has their own opinions on all of these distros. Anyway, that will conclude this video and also this year, but I can't leave you without one last mention of our sponsor, Tuxedo Computers. They make desktops and laptops that ship with Linux pre-installed. Their main goal is just to have hardware that runs really well with Linux. They even contribute directly to drivers, to the kernel, or have their own repos for drivers that haven't been mainstreamed just yet to help with that compatibility. They also have a very big range that should fit every price point and every need. Everything that I do these days for teaching, for this channel, for the other channel, for gaming, it is done on one of their devices. So do click the link in the description, check out what Tuxedo has to offer. They're really good. Anyway, that's gonna be it for me. I hope you enjoyed the video. You know what to do with all the usual YouTube buttons. And if you really want to support the channel, there are some links in the description to do just that. You'll get plenty of really cool perks in the process, and it's like $1 per month, so check it out. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and I guess you'll see me in the next one. Bye!